set to be the latest Latin American country to elect left-wing government after Bolivia, Argentina, and Mexico have done so in the last couple of years. But faced with this progressive threat, there are growing concerns that some, both inside and outside of Ecuador, are pursuing undemocratic means to prevent a left-wing victory. So we've organised tonight's meeting to hear about the progressive policies of Andres Arauz and to get updates on the right-wing attempts to sabotage such a victory. But we also want to look at how we can offer our solidarity to defend the right of the Ecuadorian people to pursue their own path, free from any intervention and any sabotage. And to look at that, we have three excellent speakers. We have Esther Cuesta, who's an Ecuadorian MP. We have Fidel Narvaez, an Ecuadorian human rights expert. And we have Richard Burgon, MP. Esther will be joining us as soon as she's finished her radio show. She's just taking a last opportunity to speak to voters and to speak to migrants who live all across Ecuador, who are able to, all across Europe, who are able to vote in the coming elections. So she'll be joining us as soon as the other two speakers are finished. We'll be hearing from each speaker, and then we'll have time for your questions. So you can put your questions into the Q&A chat on Zoom. This event has been organised by Friends of Ecuador and by Labour Friends of Progressive Latin America, and it's been kindly hosted by the Arise Festival of Labour Left Ideas. There's been hundreds of registrations for tonight's event, and as well as this Zoom webinar, we're also streaming on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. And we'll be sharing the event over the coming days, so keep your eye out for that and help us spread the message. We're going to go to our first speaker now, who's Fidel Narvaez. Fidel is an Ecuadorian human rights expert. He was a former Ecuadorian diplomat here in London, and he long worked to support the asylum granted to Julian Assange in Ecuador's embassy in London before Ecuador's current neoliberal government handed Julian Assange over to the British authorities, and where now Julian Assange is in Belmarsh prison, facing the very real threat of extradition to the US, despite recent court judgment. So we'll go over to Fidel, and our next speaker will be Richard Berger.
Thank you, Lee, and good evening, everybody. I'm very, very pleased and privileged to address to all of you tonight, just days before of a very, very important, I would say, crucial election for my country in modern history. As Lee has already introduced, the choice on the 11th of April couldn't be more clear in Ecuador. Basically, we are choosing between the continuation of the neoliberal agenda implemented by the current government of Lenin Moreno, or we are choosing the comeback to the progressive project that governed Ecuador for more than 10 years, known as the Citizen Revolution, of which achievements many of you are familiar. So what we have next Sunday is basically the ballotage, the second round. Andres Arauz's victory in the first round on February this year, with about 33% of the vote, took place in a tremendously adverse context. Similarly to other countries in the region, in Ecuador, the main progressive political force, the Citizen Revolution, had faced persecution marked by what we know as lawfare. By lawfare, we understand the use of the judiciary hand in hand with the media power to persecute and to ban the most visible progressive leaders from the political arena. So we need to understand this electoral process in Ecuador in the context of the fragility of Latin American democracies, the hemispheric geopolitical scenario, and the systematic use of lawfare. We fear that the lawfare cases with more significant impacts, like the ones in Brazil and Argentina, or the violent, illegal, and illegitimate events that occur in Bolivia after the 2019 elections, for example, are unfortunately dreadful threats for Ecuador as well. Let's remember how Lula da Silva was convicted of alleged corruption, received a sentence of 12 years, and was banned from the presidential race in Brazil. Something similar happened in Ecuador, when judges condemned Rafael Correa in record time to prevent him from running for vice president. As we know, now the Brazilian Supreme Court overturned Lula da Silva's sentence, but Lula had already spent 19 months in prison. We should also look at what's occurring in Argentina, where the Vice President Cristina Fernandez was indicted in about 10 cases, but now, today, the Argentinian justice is already setting the record straight. In Bolivia, the anti-democratic right-wing plotters who caused violence, illegal arrests, and perpetrated thousands of wounded and dozens of deaths are already facing justice, accused of terrorism, sedition, and conspiracy. In Ecuador, as I said, former President Rafael Correa has been banned from running for any political office and has been charged with allegations that would have not placed in an independent and impartial judicial system. Former Vice President Jorge Glass is unjustly imprisoned for more than 3 years without having had due process of law. And several leaders of the citizen revolution face persecutory judicial processes, and several others have had to go into exile and request political asylum abroad. Our political movement, the citizen revolution, which ruled successfully for 10 years, from 2007 to 2017, beginning of 17, won 14 consecutive elections and continues to be the largest political force in Ecuador. Our movement was banned from running in these elections. The electoral authorities, controlled by the government, did not allow us to register to compete electorally, so that for the first time, we are competing through another party, under another name, using another symbols, another colors, another images. Lawfare basically has been instrumental to disrespect basic human and democratic rights in Ecuador. But the main goal has been to implement a neoliberal agenda. In other words, if Lula, Cristina in Argentina, Evo Morales in Bolivia, or Rafael Correa in Ecuador, if all of them were neoliberals, they would not be political persecutors. Ecuador case falls into surreal dimensions. The neoliberals did not win any election and did not use violence on the streets or allege electoral fraud in Ecuador to get into power. Incumbent President Moreno, 4 years ago, won the election under the Citizen Revolution platform. But once in power, he betrayed his own movement, his voters. Basically, he betrayed his country. Could somebody imagine here a scenario when in the United Kingdom, for example, Jeremy Corbyn gets into power and next day he starts implementing the Conservative Manifesto, proclaiming that all his life he was wrong and suddenly realized that the Conservative Manifesto is much better? That's what happened in Ecuador. 4 years after, Lenin Moreno is the least popular president in Latin America, maybe the least popular in the world, with ample unpopularity rating under 5%. Although no political force wants to be associated with the government because it's so unpopular, unfortunately, Moreno still enjoys the backing of the powers to be, mainly the corporate media, the military, the elites, and the financial powers. Why? Because he is implementing the neoliberal agenda and has completely submitted the country to the US agenda for the region. Under different circumstances, Moreno should have been kicked out of power long ago. As, for example, in last October 2019, after massive social protests, when the Ecuadorian population finally took to the streets to reject the neoliberal International Monetary Fund recipes, a brutal repression took place, which have killed 11 people, injured thousands, and illegally detained hundreds. As a result of that, Ecuador's Human Rights Ombudsman this month released a report into the widespread abuses that took place. The report cites how police and military agents of the Ecuadorian state committed crimes against humanity during the uprising, including extrajudicial killings, attempted killings, sexual violence, and torture. The Ombudsman Office has officially presented the complaint against President Moreno, ministers, former ministers, and senior police officers over what it described as generalized attack against the civilian population. In any democratic society, if the highest human rights authority accuses a president of crimes against humanity and requests the judicial authorities to prevent the president leaving the country, this surely should be front page news. Well, in surreal Ecuador, this is hardly news. As surreal as when in 2010, during an attempt coup d'etat against President Correa, who was kidnapped for more than 10 hours by a police insurrection, and when for the first time people came out to the streets not to protest against the government, but to defend the president, and when several people were killed on the streets, including one of the special forces bodyguards who was protecting the president, the bodyguard was killed by a bullet aimed to kill the president. Then the president was rescued, and in the following years, investigations and the process put several people in jail. Many of them got pardoned by the then President Correa. Under the new government, the victimizers present themselves as the victims, and Correa is accused and persecuted for the deaths occurred when he was nearly killed. More recently, we have seen dead bodies laying on the streets of Ecuador, Guayaquil, the biggest city, due to the government's negligent and inhuman way to deal with COVID-19 pandemic. And President Moreno dares to blame the population for the irresponsibility of not keeping their dead bodies inside the houses. During 10 years of the citizen revolution, 21 new hospitals and more than 100 medical centers were built, fully operational with the top technology available, and other 36 hospitals were fully refurbished. Ecuador was the only country in Latin America with these hospitals accredited by the highest quality international standards. Public health care became totally free. The United Nations in 2017 declared the new Ecuadorian health system as the most innovative in the world. So how easy is for the neoliberals to destroy public services in order to privatize them later. Ecuador today shows some of the worst excess death rates in the world from COVID-19. Likewise, under the citizen revolution, Ecuadorian economy doubled in only 10 years. Poverty reduction went from 37% to 22%, and extreme poverty reduced by more than half to only 7%. When Moreno came to power in 2017, the economy was growing. Today, only 4 years later, when Moreno was leaving, the economy is decreasing by more than 10%. As Lee mentioned at the beginning, the worst economic crisis in Ecuadorian history. Under the citizen revolution, Ecuador increased its social investment by 4 times only in 10 years, allowing the country to have the highest rate of social investment in Latin America. Today, the International Monetary Fund recipe means cuts in social investment, education, health, housing, etc. Under Rafael Correa, the government income tax revenues have more than tripled. And all this achieved practically without increasing taxes, just making sure the rich and powerful pay their due. Under Moreno, on the contrary, the ministers of the economy are the representatives of elite business and banking sector. So most of the debt of wealthy companies to the tax revenue agency have been forgiven. Ecuador, under the citizen revolution, firmly confronted the transnational companies, as for example, Chevron Texaco, who caused one of the biggest environmental disasters on the planet, systematically dumping millions of oil waste in our Amazon jungle, and refuses to comply with the sentence by Ecuadorian courts to pay for damages. That very same company has decorated Lenin Moreno in one of his many visits to the United States. The country that had kicked out the biggest US military base in South America under President Correa has now agreed to let US military planes to use Galapagos Islands as a military landing facility. Under the citizen revolution, Ecuador became the first nation to give rights to nature. The country achieved one of the cleanest energy matrices in the world, with over 94% of our electricity generated by renewable energy. Under the neoliberals today, Ecuador, according to The Guardian, is among those countries receiving hundreds of thousands of tons of American plastic transported each year to developing countries around the world with poor regulations of the dirty and laborious process of recycling. The country that has hosted UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, the country that has hosted UNASUR headquarters, having Quito being basically as the capital of UNASUR, is the one at the forefront trying to destroy it. It's like Belgium in Europe saying that it doesn't want to have the EU headquarters in Brussels. In 2012, Ecuador, under President Correa, gave political asylum to WikiLeaks editor Julian Assange and protected him for nearly 7 years. Well, have you ever heard that the sovereign nation opens the doors of its own embassy to allow a foreign force to come in and kidnap a political refugee whose only crime was to expose war crimes and war criminals? So this election, which by the way take place exactly 2 years after the eviction of Julian Assange on April the 11th, are crucial not only to recover democracy, rule of law, civil and political rights, but is also key to retake the progressive agenda in Ecuador and to shift the geopolitical balance in the region. Ecuador's citizen revolution was not only successful, showing that there is an alternative to the free market, but it was also successful sending bold messages to the rest of the world by leading international campaigns, like, for example, campaigns on the need of an international body to take transnational companies accountable for the abuses to human rights and the rights of nature. Ecuador used to lead the UN Intergovernmental Working Group on transnational corporations and other businesses, enterprises with respect to human rights. Or the campaign on the need of eradicating tax havens, a cornerstone of the global economic system that generates inequality and social injustice. According to conservative estimates, something like 7.6 trillion is hidden globally by wealthy individuals offshore. The Ecuadorian government, under the Citizen Revolution, proposed the creation of a global body of the United Nations that can put an end to tax havens. It is also estimated that the equivalent to 30% of Ecuador's GDP, 30% of Ecuador's GDP is hidden in tax havens. Among the most prominent offshore assets holders is the banker Guillermo Lasso, the neoliberal presidential candidate facing us on Sunday, the 11th of April. In February 2017, Ecuador held a referendum to bar public servants from using tax havens, and Ecuador became basically the first country where the owners of accounts in tax havens are not able to hold public office. So, in fact, Mr. Guillermo Lasso should not be able to be even running in the election, and it shouldn't be possible for him to become Ecuadorian president. So, to finalize, in Ecuador, the return of neoliberalism was not the result of a democratic election, but it was the result of a political betrayal in a surreal extension. On April 11th, however, the return of the progressive forces will be the result of a democratic election against internal and external powerful reactionary forces. That is why we welcome the support and the solidarity of all the progressives around the world, like all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Fidel. That was an excellent introduction to tonight's meeting. Very thorough, showing exactly what the choice is on Sunday. Just a reminder that after our next speaker, we'll be putting questions to them. So you can pop your questions into the Q&A, and then we'll be putting them to our two speakers, and then Esther will be joining us after her radio show. Just before we move on to our next speaker, which is Richard Burgon, just to say that in the chat, you should see the link for to make donations. It costs a lot of money to put these events on Zoom. Zoom webinars cost a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to send out the information to people. And especially as we're growing more and more, costs ever more money. So if you could make a donation, giving anything you can, it all helps to keep on being able to put on these events. So I'll move on now to our next speaker, who's Richard Burgon. And after that, as I've said already, Esther will be coming to address us straight from her radio show. Now, Richard Berger will be familiar to many of you. He's a longtime friend of all of the peoples of Latin America who are struggling against neoliberalism and injustice. Richard is the chair of the Bolivia Solidarity Initiative. He recently was one of the MPs in Britain who nominated the Cuban medical brigades who've gone around the world tackling COVID. He's nominated them to be the recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. And he's been a strong supporter of the left in Ecuador and recently put down a parliamentary motion signed by, I think, 18 Labour MPs so far, expressing concerns about anti-democratic practices in this election. So we'll move on to Richard now, and then we'll hear from Esther after.
Thanks very much, Lee, and thanks, Fidel, for opening up this meeting. And thank you to the organisers for the invitation to speak tonight. Now, it's a couple of years ago that I held a meeting with Andres Arauz in the British Parliament to listen to him and to learn about what Ecuador's left has achieved in power over the past decade. Now, I was left very impressed, not just with Andres himself, but also with the huge advances in tackling poverty and tackling inequality in Ecuador under the government of Rafael Correa. Ecuador is just one example of why, quite rightly, no region has had such an influence on the Western left in recent years as the pink tide of progressive Latin American governments elected since the turn of the century. Now, at a time when many were declaring the end of history and the final triumph of the free market, leaders such as Evo Morales in Bolivia and Rafael Correa in Ecuador, as well as others, showed that there is an alternative. Now, the achievements of the left in government in Latin America are in the main very impressive. Take one measure, crucially, poverty reduction. Across the region, the poverty rate fell from 44% to 28% between 2002 and 2013, after actually rising over the previous 2 decades, lifting many tens of millions of people out of poverty. Others benefited from increased public investment in education and in healthcare, increases in minimum wages, massive house building programs, public pensions for the first time, and much, much more. Practical, life-changing achievements. Of course, there is much more to be done. Latin America remains the most unequal continent on earth, but these progressive governments showed what governments could do when they intervened and didn't just leave everything to the hidden hand of the market. Now, Latin America's pink tide of progressive governments of the last 20 or so years has taken many forms, each one reflective of the specific circumstances in which that particular country found itself at that particular time. But the progressive governments have all had one thing in common, and that's the huge resistance that they met from the elites in their own country and from the elites internationally, especially from the elites in Washington. And the role of our own government has often been incredibly worrying too. So just as the Cuban Revolution was met with a murderous blockade that has cost the islands many tens of billions of dollars, and just as Salvador Allende faced a military coup in Chile, every step forward in Latin America this century also has been met with the strong opposition from the strongest and most powerful of reactionary forces. It's worth reminding ourselves of the pressure that these left governments have faced, because we need to understand that left projects all over the world face huge offensives and attempts at regime change, attempts at destabilization whenever and wherever they seek to win power. Now, that's one of the reasons that we on the left need to be internationalist. It's one of the reasons why we on the left need to offer solidarity to those struggling for justice all over the world. Now, one recent article I read said that there had been over 80 coups in South America and the Caribbean in the 20th century, with Bolivia and Ecuador being some of the most hit countries. 63 of those coups were military-led, and this nefarious history has continued into this, the 21st century. There was a military coup attempted against Hugo Chavez in 2002 in Venezuela, captured in the powerful documentary, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. There was a successful military coup in Honduras in 2009. And there was, of course, the coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2019 that ousted him. And there was also an attempted police coup in Ecuador in 2010 that sought to oust Rafael Correa. Then, of course, there have been the so-called judicial and parliamentary coups using lawfare that ousted the president in Paraguay in 2012, and then Brazil's first female president, Dilma Rousseff, in 2016. So nowadays, military interventions appear to be less common than in the past. The strategy of the elites in Washington and in South America has been to use now the judicial witch hunts to oust candidates. So we've seen recently in Brazil this happen. Former left-wing president Lula da Silva was the favourite to win the 2018 election before being jailed on fake corruption charges. Now, the full sordid details of the judicial witch hunts against Lula are now on public record. And last month, a court found Lula innocent, and the guilt of the judge who targeted Lula is now clear for all to see in Brazil and the world over. Now, this was all part of a plot against Lula. And I have to congratulate sites like Brazil Wire, who've highlighted how this wasn't just the response of a local oligarchy desperate to cling on to power, but it was the result of a regional strategy, often stemming from Washington. Now, of course, Ecuador's Rafael Correa was also subjected to this type of pressure, banned from standing for president, banned from standing even for vice presidents in the current set of elections in Ecuador. And Correa himself faces numerous trumped-up criminal charges designed to keep him out of his own country. And we're already seeing similar campaigns against Andres Arauz in Ecuador now, which is why I put down the motion in the British Parliament recently, warning against interventions and warning against any sabotage of the rights of the people of Ecuador to express their democratic will. Now, our government mustn't in any way support any efforts by the Ecuadorian elites to undermine the democratic results. Now, with the recent coup in Bolivia, our government, let's make no bones about it, acted completely disgracefully. In its official statement, the UK government congratulated the coup president on taking office. Now, when myself, Jeremy Corbyn and others offered solidarity, we were attacked by the Tories. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, even accused Jeremy of putting Marxist solidarity ahead of democracy. Now, we know, don't we? There will be all sorts of attempts to prevent and arouse victory. Some will be bending the rules of the game with media smears, the kind of which we saw deployed with devastating effect against Jeremy Corbyn. and others could well be outside the rules of the game. The threat of judicial interventions will continue even if Arauz wins. So we need to be ready. We need to be ready to speak out and to put pressure on our government to speak out if democracy is undermined. And all of these examples that I've given of coups and lawfare and the rest underline one key point that gets lost in all the propaganda that circulates on the subject of Latin America. The truth of the matter is, no matter how uncomfortable it is for their cheerleaders in this country, is that in Latin America, it's the right that poses the greatest threat to democracy. It's the right that poses the greatest threat to democracy. And this is linked to the failure of the model that the right advocates. Ever since the violent, monstrous birth of neoliberalism in the 73 coup in Chile, its Latin American advocates have pushed for a minimal role for the state in the economy, but a very active role for the state in repressing those opposed to the free market extremism that they evangelize. The right to pursue an economic model that serves a minority interest, the minority interests of the elite, and which is deeply unpopular. And that's why the elite has had to resort to coups. That's why the right has had to resort to coups, to violence, to repression in Bolivia and in Brazil in recent years. Because when people have had a chance to vote on the neoliberal project, they've voted against it more often than not in this century. So to counter that, the right has tried to subvert the course of democracy. Tragically, although all too predictably, Western governments have been complicit in legitimising the growing use of lawfare, including through their absolute silence. Yet they're often quick to speak out about the failures of the left-wing government, and where errors are made, as they are by all governments, there should, of course, be a robust debate in those countries and mistakes corrected. But we rarely hear the successes of the left-wing government, and we almost never hear of the failures of the right in government. And in Latin America, the right in government has often been a disaster. Ecuador is a great example to highlight this obscene media distortion. Under President Rafael Correa, Ecuador had one of the most successful governments in the world, objectively. Poverty fell by a third. Ecuador achieved the region's greatest reduction in inequality, achieved strong economic growth, achieved huge investments in healthcare, and achieved huge investments in education, alongside radical tax justice and debt cancellation policies of the kind that Fidel alluded to earlier in this meeting. Ecuador began to forge its own independent path by removing the largest US military base in South America from its soil, and it promoted greater Latin American cooperation by hosting the new Union of South American Nations, and it defended global human rights by giving Julian Assange asylum when the US sought to persecute him for exposing Washington war crimes. These, make no mistake, were huge gains, and we on the left in this country have to be humble enough to look around the world and learn from such experiences. Let's contrast these gains with the assault after assault after assault against the population under Ecuador's current neoliberal government. Ecuador is now on the authoritarian path, suppressing democracy whilst pursuing extreme free market economics. The IMF is again in charge of Ecuador's economic policy and driving through attacks on public services, driving through privatizations, driving through harmful deregulation. Ecuador's disastrous response to the coronavirus crisis is just one of the starkest consequences of this. Ecuador has one of the world's highest excess deaths adjusted for population size, nearly 50% higher even than here in the UK. There have been nightmarish scenes with corpses left lying in the streets as hospitals were overwhelmed. The slashing of the public health budget and the sacking of thousands of healthcare workers undoubtedly contributed to this abject horror. So let's hope that this weekend the left wins and joins those recent victories in Bolivia, in Argentina, and in Mexico. The latest rise of the left in Latin America should give us all confidence that change is possible and that you have to keep on struggling against the odds to secure it. Now, of course, I hope that Andres Arauz wins this Sunday, because that will be a huge step forwards in rebuilding social justice and restoring hope for millions of people. But that is a decision for the people of Ecuador alone. Over the coming days, progressives in our country and around the world need to do their duty in speaking out to ensure that the Ecuadorian people have free and fair elections, free from any external intervention, free from any domestic sabotage, and for the democratic will of the Ecuadorian people to be respected. I'm delighted to be with you tonight.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. Our next speaker is Esther Cuesta. Before I introduce her, I just want to say in the chat, everybody should see details of another meeting that we're organizing on Monday on Latin America, this time on Bolivia, which will mark 6 months on from the victory over the coup, since the election rather, of the progressive government, and therefore the victory over the coup. All the details are in the chat. We have a key speaker at that meeting. That's going to be Jeremy Corbyn, plus lots of comrades coming from the United States, from Bolivia and elsewhere. So you can get the details in the chat there, and that'll be looking at what that progressive government of Bolivia has done over the last number of months, and hopefully that's something we'll be able to do in 6 months' time, looking at what the progressive achievements of Ecuador has been over the 6 months after Andres' victory. Now, our next speaker is Esther Cuesta. Esther is an Ecuadorian MP. She represents Ecuadorian migrants who live in Europe. In Ecuador's parliament, migrants have reserved seats following some of the progressive changes to the constitution under the government of Rafael Correa. And Esther is an MP for the same movement as Andres Arauz, the Union for Hope movement. So over to you, Esther.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, Richard, Lee, Fidel, and everyone. Thank you for joining everyone this conversation. Thank you to Friends of Ecuador and Labor Friends for organizing this webinar to talk about the Ecuadorian presidential election, and really an opportunity for us to share what's at stake in this ballotage this Sunday, April 11th. So what's at stake? I would say mainly the essence of democracy. Democracy, as we all know, comes from the Greek demos, meaning people. In broad brushstrokes, democracy exists when the people take part in the decisions of a government, when the power of a government is vested in the people, when there is independence of the different state powers, the legislative, the executive, the judiciary, when there is rule of law. What we have had in the last 4 years in Ecuador is anything but democracy. What we have experienced is a systematic breakdown of the democratic rules, as well as the principles contained in our constitution and legal procedures, which started after the constitutional referendum proposed by President Lenín Moreno in 2018, without the consent of the Constitutional Court. I don't know of any democratic country in Europe or in the history of the UK that has had a sitting government propose a referendum to enact constitutional amendments without the consent of the Constitutional Court. This 2018 referendum was clearly unconstitutional and broke the rule of law. Since the referendum, the authorities of the major controlling institutions of the state, including the state comptroller, the general prosecutor, the judicial council, and over 100 additional authorities were dismissed or replaced illegally, with many of their cases now in national and international courts and being reviewed at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. Also, 23 out of 26 justices of the National Court of Justice were replaced by temporary judges, judges that work without the proper autonomy, independence, and impartiality. There is no surprise that former President Rafael Correa has dozens of judicial cases against him, and the Cassation Court issued a very much TV publicized Correa's case in just 17 days, a record in Ecuador's judicial history, condemning Rafael Correa to 8 years of prison and 22 years of not being allowed to exercise his political rights, thus unable to participate in popular elections. In 2017, Moreno won the presidential election with a government plan to consolidate the advances in human rights, development, energy sustainability, to get out of the dependence of the oil extraction in Ecuador's economy, to industrialize Ecuador's economy, to advance the progressive public policies implemented during the government of Rafael Correa. But once in government, in May 2017, Moreno implemented the government plan of the banker Guillermo Lasso, this billionaire who tries for the third time to be Ecuador's president. So Lasso's government plan is what we Ecuadorians have experienced in these last 4 years, applying austerity measures, privatizing public services, allowing the layoff of thousands of Ecuadorians in the public and private sector, increasing the poverty of the Ecuadorian population. Let me just give you one statistic. During the government of Rafael Correa, 2 million people in Ecuador got out of poverty. By 2017, at the end of Correa's government, still a little less than 30% of the Ecuadorian population lived in poverty or extreme poverty. Today, after 4 years of the government of Moreno and Lasso, half of the Ecuadorian population, we're talking about 50%. That means more than 8 million people live in poverty or extreme poverty in Ecuador. That means living with less than $84.49 a month. So besides this dramatic impoverishment of the Ecuadorian population, the management of the pandemic has been negligent. The government has just done nothing to manage this pandemic. In fact, it has been a criminal management. In the middle of the pandemic, the government of Moreno and Lasso laid off 6,000 physicians, nurses, and medical staff. In the middle of the pandemic, when hospitals needed physicians, the government laid them off. So more than 40,000 people died in excess in 2020 in Ecuador compared to 2019. You may remember the images of the dead for up to 4 or 5 days in the houses of the people or on the sidewalks, on the streets, under unsanitary conditions in 30 degrees in Guayaquil, my city. So it hurts me even personally. People remain outside of public hospitals because hospitals simply collapsed, because patients could not afford $2,000 to pay per day in an intensive care unit in a private hospital. So in these 4 years, adding to the dramatic deterioration of the quality of life of Ecuadorians, Moreno's government has dedicated itself to persecute its political adversaries through lawfare. So in 5 days, this Sunday, Ecuadorians will have the runoff of the presidential election. Andres Arauz, a young progressive leader that represents this huge alliance, Union for Hope, Unión por la Esperanza, has been leading in all national presidential polls since the end of last year. All of them, except one that was realized paid by Lasso, the other candidate. No, the other ones are pretty much giving accurate information. So oligarchs, the elites, which represent 1% of the Ecuadorian population, who have their money in tax havens, have said about a campaign of fear, which is nothing new. Unfortunately, political marketing eludes the emotions of people, so that people vote a certain way for fear of something: fear of immigrants, fear of illness, fear of death, fear of the government taking your properties away, etc. So we understand this electoral process in Ecuador in the context of the fragility of Latin American democracies, the hemispheric geopolitical relations of powers, the systematic use of lawfare against political adversaries to eliminate them from the political arena. So we ask the international community, we ask our friends in the UK to stay vigilant, particularly with regard to the interference of illegal actors outside the electoral process, and to continue supporting Ecuadorian democracy. Let me remember here that at the moment, Ecuador is in a state of emergency or a state of exception. In this state of exception, what happens? The most populated provinces of Ecuador are under a state of exception. That means there is a restriction of mobility of citizens. You cannot associate with people. You cannot get out of the house out of a certain time. So all this is happening during the electoral process. On April 11th, we're going to be in 5 provinces, the most populated ones, in a state of exception, which will allow the government to take decisions to deploy the military, to deploy the armed forces, to control the citizens. So this is very worrisome for us. So we're very attentive. Let me just finish with a reflection about democracy, which is where I started. Democracy is also social equity. It's also the fact that the ones who earn more have the obligation to contribute more to the state, to the well-being of the collectivity. So the government that is vested in the people can develop public policy to distribute the income and to reduce poverty. We cannot have full democracy in Ecuador when half of the population live under poverty level. A democracy also means a distribution of wealth, where only few people have wealth, access to basic services, to fundamental rights like health, like education, like opportunities to develop their capabilities, where today 6 out of 10 children in Ecuador cannot attend school because they don't have access to internet. We cannot call a real democracy, a consolidated democracy in Ecuador. We need to decide what's the kind of Ecuador we want, not for the four years, for the next 4 years, but for the next generations of Ecuador, that our children will have the opportunity to grow, but also to be happy. That is also part of being alive. In these times of pandemic, in these times of fear, we also need happiness, we also need well-being. And this is the buen vivir that is established in our constitution. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Esther. Well, we've had over 200 people on the chat, on the call rather. We've got 150 on the Zoom webinar, and we've got many others tuning into the streams, and we've been swamped with questions. We won't be able to, unfortunately, take all of the questions because we'll be here all evening. But what I'll try to do is I'll try to summarize some of the questions, some of the themes, and I'll ask the person I think is best able to answer them to come back. And I want to give Esther a bit of a break because she'll be able to answer all of them, but she's just spoken. Esther, when you come back in a minute, Fidel's going to go first, but when you come back, we've got some questions on what is Andres's domestic agenda, what's he standing on, what are his main policies, what is his relationship to different social movements in Ecuador, the movement of students, of women, etc. I hope that covers some of the different questions we've had on that theme. Fidel, if you would come in now, please. I'm looking at Andres's foreign policy, his attitude to both the other left governments in Latin America, regional integration in the United States. You could take a couple of minutes on that. And then if you could just give us a little update, please, on the situation with the divisions within the indigenous community. We've had quite a few questions on that. That's a lot to cover. If you could cover it in 2 minutes on the foreign policy and 2 minutes on indigenous, please, so that we get through quite a few questions. Then we'll go to Esther, and then we've got some questions aimed at Richard.
Thank you, Lee. Well, listen, as I mentioned in my intervention, Ecuador became the capital of UNASUR, and that's basically because the leading role that the Civil Revolution had in what we call the regional integration. The regional integration is so important for our foreign policy that's even included as a priority in our constitution. So it shouldn't be a choice of the government to pursue or not regional integration. It's an strategic aim of Ecuadorian foreign policy. And Andres is absolutely convinced of that. When he was a minister and when he worked at the central bank, he was in fact in charge of drafting and then working on several projects which relate to the regional integration. One of them, for example, the Banco del Sur, or the Bank of the South, basically under the logic that why is that the South American economies still have many resources in North American banks, in Euro banks, when we can put together our own reserves and create basically our own regional monetary institutions, financial institutions that will allow us to access to our own resources to finance our own development projects. So I'm totally sure that once Andres is in power, regional integration in South America will retake a dynamic, and it will become a priority for Ecuador. And good relationships with every single country in the world under the premise of mutual respect. Even under Rafael Correa. Rafael Correa always said, I am not anti-American. I am not anti-imperialist. I am for sovereign, respectful relationships with every country in the world. And obviously they will look for diversification of markets, diversification of foreign relationships with every country in the world. That was the first question. The second question is a bit more complex, obviously. The indigenous movement is, true to be said, the more important social movement in Ecuador. It has been fundamental in the 90s and in the first 10 years of this century in impeding the neoliberal agenda to be implemented in full in Ecuador. But as any other social movement, they have also achieved quite relevant political representation in governments, in parliament, and as such, sometimes, in my opinion, they have also taken political behavior as any other political party. I wouldn't say that they are united in one in one electoral decision in this election. They did have their own candidate. Their own candidate did quite well. It was very, very close call between him and the second one, Guillermo Lasso. In fact, the candidate claimed fraud and claimed that he should be running the second round with Andres Arauz. For the second round, officially, the Pachakutik movement have called for the void vote, or voto nulo, as we say in Spanish. So they are officially not opting for one or the other option, which is very disappointing, actually, because the progressive agenda of the citizen revolution and Andres Arauz has many coincidences and many shared goals with the progressive agenda of the indigenous movement. However, they are not united. There are several indigenous leaders and several indigenous organizations within the indigenous movement that are clearly supporting and publicly supporting us, Andres Arauz. And in my opinion, most of the ordinary indigenous individuals, the indigenous vote will go at the end for Andres Arauz rather than for the neoliberal Guillermo Lasso.
Brilliantly handled, Fidel. I know that was two huge topics to try and cover in 4 minutes. Esther, could you just give a short summary of what you think are the main policies that Andres is standing on to try to motivate the vote on Sunday? I saw one policy about free broadband for people, which is something that's been a huge political issue in Britain. It was something Jeremy Corbyn stood on at the last election, and with us all locked in our homes over the last year or so, it's become a policy that's become more relevant than ever. But if you could just give a summary of what policies Andres is standing on.
Yes, of course. Well, Andres is proposing what the United Nations, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Nations, even the World Bank have recommended to the countries around the world to inject money to the families so that in a moment of crisis, families do not lose the income, even if they lose their jobs. So one of the main proposals is to reactivate the economy, to inject money to the families, mainly to women. And people will say, just women. Well, usually the woman is the one who's in charge of, whether the children are eating, paying the debts that he has in the market, in the supermarket, in the bank. So that will reactivate the economy because the woman will need, the people will buy something and the store will have the demand for the product, will have to hire employees. The employees will be hired and they will, it will be like a chain to activate the economy. Another issue that is very important in Ecuador is to support the small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, which are the motor of the Ecuadorian economy. How are we going to do this? We're going to give $3 million in credits for the medium-sized, the small entrepreneurs in Ecuador. And many of them are also return migrants and migrants. We have sent the remittances for years to our families in Ecuador. We migrants, I represent migrants, and we also have these little businesses that also need to be supported by the government. In this crisis, people are absolutely drowning in debts, with the bank. People cannot pay the credit cards, they cannot pay the different credits that they have in the bank, in the financial sector. Even the banks, in this crisis, when people have lost their jobs, the only sector that have made money is the banking sector. In a moment of crisis, Lasso, who is this billionaire, right, main owner of this bank, he has, according to official statistics, this is now that I'm inventing it, official data, he earned $6,004,000 in 2020, when the economy of Ecuador was just collapsing. So our proposals are inject money to the families, give credit to the people, alleviate the debts that people have in the banking sector, promote education, promote health, create a plan of vaccination in the country, transparent, efficient, and basically provide access to rights of people, health, education, jobs, income, infrastructure, and well-being of the people. We don't listen to you, Lee.
There you go. The last question is going to be for Richard. We've had a number of questions in asking about the Labour Party and its own foreign policy and what its foreign policy should be in relation to Latin America. That's a bit of a summary of 5 or 6 questions we've had in. Richard, could you just say what you think the attitude of the Labour Party, of the trade unions, of the left in Britain should be to the developments in Latin America as a whole?
Well, first of all, we need to show solidarity, don't we, when left governments or left potential governments are under threat from anti-democratic intrigues of the kind we've described tonight. And we should also get off our high horse a bit and show some humility. I was remembering earlier a meeting I attended many years ago before being an MP, where we're discussing some of these left governments in Latin America, and some left activists from a small group in Britain were criticising what this Latin American government on the left had and hadn't done, advising on its shortcomings. And I remember one comrade stood up and said, "Comrades, can we have a bit of humility, please, from our movement, which has achieved so little in this country historically? Can we listen to what they've achieved and show them solidarity?" I think that's what we need to do. We need to show solidarity. We can learn from people's experiences elsewhere. We've seen there, haven't we, as we've heard tonight, a real effective and successful move away from the neoliberalism that it's wreaked such havoc, poverty, inequality, misery, and even death and destruction in Latin America. So we need to, yes, applaud that, learn from it as we seek to build a new, better future here away from a neoliberal model. But also we need to stand in solidarity with leftists, with trade unionists, with indigenous movements and minorities in Latin America. In terms of what the Labour Party's foreign policy should be, I think I've always advocated, when I was for deputy leader, I advocated a kind of independent foreign policy where we don't just do, if Labour was in government, we shouldn't just do whatever the United States of America tells us to do. And I think what Fidel mentioned when he spoke earlier in this meeting about the idea of mutual respect is important, that, you know, we should have mutual respect for other countries. We should believe in self-determination. We shouldn't believe in democracy on a selective basis. And I think the comments I alluded to earlier from our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, about what happened in Bolivia, the coup in Bolivia, were truly disgraceful. But Labour, as a democratic socialist party in the UK, founded by the trade unions, with great links to social movements in Britain, should stand shoulder to shoulder with progressive movements in Latin America, particularly when they are subject, as I say, to anti-democratic intrigues. And so I just urge all left colleagues inside Parliament in Britain, outside Parliament in Britain, in our trade unions, to carry on speaking up for the right of the Ecuadorian people to determine their own future, free from interference, free from anti-democratic intrigue. You know, we've heard tonight of what's happening in Ecuador, and we've heard exactly why movements around the world and progressives around the world need to be vigilant about what happens in Ecuador, yes, in the next few days, but also in the event that hopefully Andres Arauz gets selected by the Ecuadorian people to be their president. We need to continue being vigilant, continuing to be supportive, because if intrigues don't prevent the election, the free and fair election of Andres Arauz, then the elites, both in Ecuador and elsewhere, including perhaps in Washington, will attempt to move against that government and ensure that it can't do the job it was elected to do, or that its time in office is as short as possible. That's the Ecuadorian people to decide. I believe the UK Labour Party should always have an international policy of anti-war internationalism, of peace, of human rights, of standing in solidarity with the oppressed around the world, and also those who are trying to forge a better future. And on this particular subject of Ecuador, I just call on the whole of the progressive movement in our country to do its duty, observe very closely what happens in Ecuador in the upcoming days, and speak up for the right of the Ecuadorian people to determine their own future. There's a lot of high talk about democracy from people involved in politics in our country, of course, and democracy is so important. But it's at times like this where you put to the test, are you going to speak up about it? Are you going to make the case? Are you going to stand in solidarity or not? So I think we should take inspiration from our own best traditions of our movement in this country and speak up in solidarity as internationalists, as socialists, with the people of Ecuador, their progressive movements, and their right to determine who is their president and who is their government.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a brilliant meeting. It's been a very informative meeting. It's been a very well attended meeting. But I think it's time now to start to wrap it to a close. Just before we do, just a reminder to everybody, there's a link in the chat about making your donations to help us cover the cost of this meeting. As I said, it's very expensive to cover the Zoom webinars and all the mass emails and everything. That will help us keep on doing this, keep on having meetings on a regular basis. Obviously, it's only right that we end with the voices of the Ecuadorians at this meeting. So Esther and Fidel, if you'd both like to take 30 seconds a minute for any final points. We'll start with Fidel and we'll end with Esther to close the meeting.
Thank you, Lee. Can you hear me? Yeah. No, basically, I want to thank you, the organizers, Friends of Ecuador. I want to thank Richard and Esther, of course, for participating and organizing and participating in this meeting. I'm very confident, I'm very hopeful that on Sunday we will recover our democracy, basically. We will recover rule of law. We will recover our dignity. And we will retake the progressive agenda that the citizen revolution held for 10 years and achieved so much that has been destroyed in the last 4 years. But it's not going to be an easy task for Andres' government. we do not have such a strong majority in parliament as we used to have. The factical powers, or the powers to be, are very much aware that those privileges and those excesses that they've been having with Lenin Moreno, they come to an end, and they will put huge resistance. So the solidarity, the international solidarity with Ecuador and with all the progressive governments in Latin America needs to continue after the election, as some of you have mentioned here. So we count on you, and thank you for the solidarity. We keep the fight, and we will celebrate together on Sunday night as we deserve to. Thanks.
Esther?
Well, I join Fidel in the thanks to you, the organizers, Friends of Ecuador, Labor Friends, and for your interest in what's going on in Ecuador. This election, this presidential election on Sunday, April 11th, defines these new winds of progressiveness, these new winds of democracy in the region, in Latin America. We saw it in Bolivia, we saw it in Argentina, we saw it in Mexico. We're gonna continue seeing it in Chile. So we're really confident that this Sunday, Ecuadorians inside the country and abroad will vote with consciousness, will vote with memory, will vote also realizing that our lives have deteriorated in these 4 years of neoliberal government, a government that rule for bankers, for the billionaires, which is 1% of the population. We need a government that puts first the human being, that puts first Ecuadorians, that puts first the people, providing health, education, and to reduce poverty in a country with such richness that we have in Ecuador. It is inconceivable. It is unacceptable that we have the poverty levels that we have right now, not because only of the pandemic, it's because of the policies, the austerity measures that have implemented this government of Moreno. So I hope that Ecuadorians will come, Ecuadorians abroad, it's facultative, it's optional to vote. So I invite all Ecuadorians who are seeing us to come and vote, to decide what's the kind of country, what's the kind of Ecuador we have. A country with rights, a country with education, a country for the people, or a country for the bankers. That's in us, the decision to take this Sunday. Thank you very much, and let's vote this Sunday.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck. See you all soon.
Thanks to you. Bye.
See you soon, Esther. Good luck.
Thanks, Esther. Thanks, Fidel. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Fidel.
Good luck.
Fidel. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ben and Paddy.